Hello and welcome to Royale Without Cheese, our bi-weekly podcast in which we discuss both the classic and the unknown of art and popular cinema from the then and now. We are your hosts, me, Tomás Ferreira, Leonardo Miranda,
Hello.
and Miguel Aido.
Hey.
This is our talk show segment where we welcome grand indie filmmakers to our wonderful couch and discuss their work. Robert Kaplow is an American novelist, screenwriter, playwright, and songwriter, a former English and film studies teacher at Summit High School in New Jersey. Kaplow has written 9 novels, various essays, a play, and produced and performed hours of radio comedy that gained a cult following on the National Public Radio. His coming-of-age novel, Me and Orson Welles, became his first entry in film, directed by Richard Linklater and adapted to the screen in 2008, being described by critic Roger Ebert as one of the best films he ever saw about the theater. Recently, Robert has been nominated for an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay for Blue Moon, a film about Broadway lyricist Lorenz Hart, as he reflects on himself during the opening night of Oklahoma! Having premiered at last year's Berlinale, it's his latest collaboration with Linklater and the film under discussion on the podcast. So, Robert, how are you feeling today?
Good. I'm happy to be here with you, and it's impressive to hear your biography.
Out loud, of course.
Yeah, right. It's
It's
embarrassing, but slightly impressive.
First of all, to embarrass you even further, congratulations on your Oscar nomination, of course. We were very happy to hear about it because we really think it is truly deserved. Blue Moon is this stunning character study that balances very well both heart, humor, and a world-building sense to the story, as we are really inviting into a Broadway of another time, the culture of the time, 1940s, through the eyes of Lorenz Hart. And so it feels fitting to really start our interview by asking you about the origin of your collaboration with Linklater, since you've done 2 films together. And so ask, what did brought you together in the making of your first film, Me and Orson Welles, and how has the writing relationship evolved with Blue Moon?
No, good question. I had written the novel, Me and Orson Welles. Friend of Richard Linklater's in Austin, Texas, had seen the novel in a bookstore window, was attracted by the title, read it. This friend is Vincent Palmo, who works with Linklater a lot. In fact, Palmo and his wife Holly co-wrote Linklater's French film that's out now, Nouvelle
Oh,
Vague.
yeah.
So I got this email that just said, Richard Linklater wants to buy the film rights to Me and Orson Welles. And I was like, well, I actually know who Richard Linklater is. I knew him primarily from Before Sunrise, which the American television just used to show over and over again. I really liked that film, and I remember watching it and thinking what I liked about it was, here's a 7-minute scene around a pinball machine between a man and a woman. I liked the theatricality of that. It's almost seen from a play, and it was not apologetic for that. The camera didn't have to go in circles and come through keyholes and pretend it was a pinball machine. The modesty of that approach appealed to me. And then I met with Richard in New York, and he said, yeah, I want to make this movie, and I've got these friends of mine, the Palmos, have written a screenplay, and we'll send it to you, and you tell me what you think. A couple of weeks later, I got it, and I read it, and I thought it was good, and I started to make notes, and by the time my notes were done, I must have had 18 single-spaced pages of notes. And, I mailed it to him, and I figured, well, they're never going to ask me again what I think. I'm too much of a pain in the ass. But no, the next draft of the script I saw, they'd used the notes. They had listened to me. They weren't irrational or, self-aggrandizing notes. It was just, I thought you didn't need this for the story, or the story could be faster, or I didn't get this. And so a lot of the notes were things I really liked that I wish I had invented. That I thought were ingenious little devices. And then they shot that film on the Isle of Man. That's where all the theatrical stuff was done. And I went to the Isle of Man just for a week and, hung out there and kind of watched the show. It was fun. And then went to the opening at the Toronto Film Festival. And, Linklater and I have just been kind of, buddies since then. I go to some of his openings in New York and talk on the phone. And he said to me one day, maybe this is a dozen years ago, he said, what are you working on, Robert? And I said, I'm trying to write this thing about Lorenz Hart. And he said, Lorenz Hart, I'm really interested in that. Could I read it? And that's the door that opened for me. Anybody else in the film industry that I said, I'm working on this thing about Lorenz Hart, they would have said, who the fuck is Lorenz Hart? Or even worse, silence. And the silence whose subtext is, why would anybody be interested in that? But he really was interested in that period, and he knew Rogers and Hart. He knew that stuff, and so I mailed him a kind of a long, meandering, rough draft, and he found it interesting.
And it's very interesting, it all comes back. It's really interesting how you start your reply by calling back to Before Sunrise and that pinball machine scene, in which I remember perfectly. It's one shot, or at least I think it is. It's from one angle,
It
nothing
feels like
fancy,
it could be one shot if it is or not. Yeah.
and that gets carried over into Blue Moon, into this very condensed real-time film. It's done in real time, and there he has always been enamored with that kind of stylization, but there he really kind of soars to new heights with that dynamic. So it's very interesting.
I'm pleased that in the process of working on it, nobody tried to change that. Or no, I thought for sure somebody was going to say to me, listen, Robert, when Elizabeth tells the story of her boyfriend in New Haven, Connecticut, in the basement of the fraternity, why don't we cut to that and show us and
No.
nobody said it, and I'm really glad they didn't, because I don't think it would have added anything. I think it actually would have diminished the intensity of that scene.
Mhm.
Yeah. I
Yeah, for
actually need
sure.
to ask, I love how that scene is constructed. I just absolutely love it. I loved how you placed the line, nobody ever loved me that much, because it has such it's a two-way street kind of answer.
Yeah.
It functions to express what he's feeling, but also like answering what Elizabeth's question was. So it's beautiful. It acts in this hidden way. And did you stage it in the script as it was visually, with Hart becoming smaller and smaller and crouching on the floor next to her?
No.
Oh, really?
I mean, I just wrote it as a scene in a cloakroom. I mean,
Okay.
it's a 14-minute scene. It's a long scene. And it was Ethan who we were working on the film. I was watching, they rehearsed it for 3 weeks in Ireland on the set, and I was there for 2 of those weeks. And Ethan came in one day and he said, that long scene with Larry and Elizabeth, he said, I think we should make it like a little 3-act play. They start standing, then she tells the story about Cooper. They're sitting down, and finally, when we get to the intimate stuff about who's in love with whom, they're sitting on the floor. And I thought that was Ethan's theater sense kicking in. He's a theater actor, and I think he knows you're going to ask an audience to sit for a 14-minute two-person scene. It has to evolve, and it has to move in a way to pull them in, so they're not going, when is this going to be over?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's the actual answer to the idea of should we have flashbacks to this? No, the flashbacks are exactly the acting that constructs this three-act play with the movement and the gesture. So that's really cool.
No, Ethan was good at that. I mean, so many times, we'd be meeting for lunch in Ireland, and he'd come in and he would always say to me, listen, this may be the worst idea you've ever heard, but and most of them were good. Most of them were good. Like that business where at the end he drops the deck of cards, and he's sort of on his knees picking them up. Um, that was his idea to stage it like that. So when you get to those lines about she's going to show up at my party and she's finally going to say, "What are you interested in, Larry? And what are you reading?" And and we know that's never going to happen. I think it's even more pathetic when he's on his knees picking up a deck of playing cards.
Even after that whole revelation, after the declaration of love, he still has some sense of delusional hope, this narrative that he brings to
Yeah,
himself. So
right.
yeah, it's heartbreaking.
It's clear that you have a passion for many writing mediums and for the written word. I think in the script, that's also something that captivated us in the stories, like the way Hart uses words. All of this also transpires in your essays, in your plays, in your songwriting. And so, of course, we wanted to know in your own words what first inspired you to write about Lorenz Hart specifically, and was there like a eureka moment, or was it an accumulation of ideas through the years as you became more familiar with him?
Yeah, I think it's probably more an accumulation. I don't know if I've ever had a eureka moment. Um, Maybe I did actually, about me and Orson Welles. When that moment I thought about that story, I actually remember driving in a car on the street where I thought, oh, it's going to be this kid, and I mean, I had that moment. I went to where I was working, which was a school at the time, and I told a friend of mine the idea for me and Orson Welles, and he sits there with a frown on his face and says, instead of Orson Welles, why don't you make him involved with Babe Ruth? More people would be interested in that. And I just thought, I'm not interested in that. But I really have loved songwriting and that period of songwriting and Rogers and all that kind of stuff. And when I thought I might actually want to be a songwriter, I listened to this long at a library in New York. I listened to this long, must have been 3-hour audio interview with Richard Rogers. In the days when these interviews were on big reels of reel-to-reel audio tape. And you're sitting
All
there
right.
with giant headphones on, listening to it, and the moment where Rogers talks about leaving Hart, there was something really very icy in it and chilling, as if he were armoring his own heart against feeling too much about what happened. If there's a eureka moment, it's that, where it's suddenly, this is a complicated emotional moment here, and Rogers feels he has to move on for his career, but he loves and has some compassion for this man who's so exasperating at the same time. And I think, you talk about words. I mean, Hart, that's what he is. He's a guy in love with language. And I think, he doesn't have the looks. He doesn't have anything. That's what he's trading in. People will finally pay attention to him if he's the funniest and cleverest man in the room. That's the commodity he trades in. And so, I think that's why I put E.B. White in the movie, so I needed him to meet another word guy, another guy that just drunk on language, and they both could become illuminated in their presence. I mean, they really admire each other. I think that works pretty well in the movie because there's no one else he could have had those conversations with but another writer.
All right.
Couldn't talk to the bartender about language or the piano player or anybody, or even Richard Rogers. I don't.
Yeah. Was there a specific reason you went with E.B. White, or is it just was
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I think I really admire E.B. White. He had just put out this book of essays he had been writing for, I think, Harper's Magazine, that were collected in a book called One Man's Meat. So Hart would have been familiar with these essays, which came out every month in the magazine, and so it just felt like it would work as a kind of jumping off point for the thing. And I knew that White was trying to write a children's novel, so I could play around with that too. And some people like that, and some people think that's a little too cutesy, but I think it's funny.
Yeah, Lorenz has beautiful moments of monologue in which he quotes other media and inspirations. One of those key moments is when we're first properly introduced to the character as he enters Sardi's bar and humorously quotes Casablanca. So, how did you think of Casablanca as a motif linked to Lorenz's introduction? Was it really a film that he liked? It is, after all, from where he takes the key line, "Nobody ever loved me that much."
Yeah, I don't know whether in the reality is he liked the film or not, but when I was just researching, I needed to recreate March of 1943, so I'm looking through old New York Timeses of the period, and I see Casablanca still playing. It came out a while ago, but it's still playing in New York, and I thought, well, I need some, contemporary cultural things that people can reference. I thought, well, why not that? Because that's at least something that modern audiences would get if I mentioned it. They would understand it. I mean, like Hitchcock's Shadow of a Doubt was out the same time, the same week, but I couldn't really reference that. I don't think enough people would get it. And it's too creepy a movie to echo in this film. But I knew Casablanca really well from the time that I used to teach film. And, that line, a precedent is being broken. I mean, I always knew that was a ridiculous line.
Yeah.
Finally got to say it. And I always loved that line when Bogart, the Bulgarian woman, says to him, would you sacrifice your honor for someone you loved? And Bogart just says, nobody ever loved me that much. I mean, it felt deeply felt, and Bogart's not that emotionally accessible an actor, but that line felt, like it was resonating with something in it. And I felt lucky that, I got to reprise the line later on in the movie too. It could come back in different ways. That's always a nice element that I think gives a screenplay a sense of sort of inevitability.
And it's nice to also hear you choose to quote films. I think it's just a thought, but it seems to connect well with your past as a film teacher. So it would make sense for to quote films like this, and at least to me, it seems to show your passion for the medium. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, the other he quotes Somerset Maugham's novel of Human Bondage, but you know, I don't know how many people in the bar would get that. And even he says, you know, you're in trouble when you're looking for the meaning of life
Exactly.
from a book with the word bondage in the title.
Yeah.
Kind of a cheap joke, but I went for it.
No, it's great. And you even play with the fact that, he's trying to invite the bartender into this intellectual conversation, and he's like, "You're looking at me? What can I say?" What can I say? So
No,
that perfectly ties in with bringing in E.B. White and him having a compadre to kind of spar with. And speaking of like interesting lines, I must say you have such enchanting character-defining lines in this film in the way that you write Hart's thoughts and opinions. Like to name a few that come to mind, like when he says, "Christ, it's like I'm 17 again." Then he pauses and says, "Except I was never 17. I went straight from trying to remember my childhood to washed up." Or like, what is the other one? Is "I'm sorry, I'm babbling, but how else can you describe the actual present tense of falling in love?" Which is just beautiful, and only Ethan Hawke can elevate that. I'm just telegraphing Ethan Hawke
no,
in me.
but I think you're right. There's something, and I think that's why, even though a lot of people were shocked when Ethan Hawke was going to play this role, I thought he has that poetic thing in him. He really does, like somebody that tastes language and delivers it like a poet would do it. And I think that's why it works. Because, he's the wrong size and he's too good looking for the part. I mean, there's a million reasons that you could say he shouldn't play the part. But that thing about someone who, relishes the word and takes delight in it too. You see Hart delighting in what he's doing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's just so many lines that he can just create a pause, rhythm, and melody with it. Like when he says, "Rogers can be a son of a bitch, a cold-hearted son of a bitch, but he can get a melody to levitate." And what's the hallmark of great art but levitation? So it's great to just create these words that become key words of the character. But what I found even more curious was that in reading a couple of your essays available on your website, like Graveyard Meeting, Good Friday, Cabin Fever, I really found that there was something to the there was an inner monologue quality to them in the way that you process your thoughts that you had on a day-to-day basis. And it made me wonder, to all this question of how do you create these iconic lines in a film, does this personal journal way of writing in your essays, has it influenced or did it help in writing Lawrence's monologues? Has it this stream of consciousness thing in the film?
That's a good question. I'm not even sure I know the answer to it. I think the essay writing, if it did anything, it helped me try to elevate the commonplace into something more memorable. No, and there's a line where E.B. White and Hart are drinking, and Hart raises a toast, and he says something like, "To the poetry that pours down on us from 1,000 unexpected sources," or something like that. And I think that's the world of those essays too. That if you look at things close enough and careful enough, they often reveal more than just a graveyard or something like that.
The other question kind of connects to this is, do you have any good writing techniques to create potent dramatic dialogue? Speaking of lines and such.
Rewriting is the answer.
Rewriting, yeah.
Right. I mean, there's not a line in this screenplay that hasn't been rewritten. And I worked on this thing for maybe a dozen years, and getting notes from Linklater and Hawke. And every time I worked on it, my rule was that I wasn't just going to work on a section of it. I was going to rewrite it from the first line to the last line every time that I worked on it. Because I thought it had like hitting a piece of crystal and it rings on a certain frequency. I thought this thing had a ring on a certain frequency, and you couldn't have, the wrong notes it's like playing a musical instrument and your hands deadening the wrong strings when you're trying to, everything had a ring. So the lines of dialogue. I mean, to me, a line of comic dialogue is really wonderful when it feels effortless, feels like Hart's just improvising this, but there's a lot of effort to make it feel that spontaneous and that effortless.
It is true, it is true. I think one of the greatest challenges in creating a scene, especially creating dialogue, is how to not, in the rewriting process, how to not over intellectualize this. Because we want the character to fulfill a certain goal, get a certain way. We know there's something opposing that one person, and we know there is an outcome at the end of the scene that value should be either negative or positive, depending on what the character is trying to pursue. But you see, to me, it's always the mystery of how do you write the scene without over intellectualizing it and trying to feel it and trying to pass through the lines, the real character without making it feel mechanic, making it feel like you're trying to convince the audience of something. That's always a big mystery that it's a work of
No, and
actively thinking about it and intuition.
and it's tough, and especially when you feel that there's exposition you have to get in there too, and you don't want to, we've all had those, seen those terrible heavy-handed expositions where, you feel the floor creaking under the weight of everything they're trying to tell you, which I think was, and I think this was, if I remember correctly, I think this was Richard's idea, which to do that little radio obituary in the beginning. So Hawke is walking down the alley, he collapses, and then you hear what's supposed to sound like a 1943 radio obituary. So it's a way in maybe 40 seconds to tell an audience who probably don't know who Lorenz Hart is everything they need to know. He was famous. These are 7 of his hit songs. So the audience go, yeah, I've heard of that. I heard My Funny Valentine. I know a little something about this. And then you don't have to do it again. And I am the voice of the radio announcer.
Yeah.
That's my
What?
one.
No
That's
way.
my
What?
one part in the movie.
Oh,
Yes,
wow, amazing.
yes, really. Richard asked Richard. I had a friend of mine from National Public Radio record it, and I thought he did a good job, but Richard didn't like it. Richard said, "Robert, I want you to record that one." I said, "All right, I'll try it."
I'll give
All
it a
right,
shot.
no. It makes perfect sense now. Like I feel like a mask has been lifted. Who is that voice? Because when I heard that voice, I thought it was the narrator of a 2008 film called The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, which my co-hosts know. It's a film I really love, and it has this particular voice that narrator, and, and it's you after all. So
It is.
amazing.
No, I was just trying to be like, Mr. Public Radio kind of
Of
voice,
course, of course.
over pronouncing the words and things like that. I had fun. I didn't think they were really going to use it, but they did.
And I have to say, it's a challenging story to tell because essentially we are dealing with a narrative that has to do with a very interior conflict, not an external classical conflict in which there are clear antagonists to deal with. We're talking about a man who is, in a sense, fighting himself, fighting his own delusions that get in the way of him actually listening to these two loves that he's trying to cling on to, Rogers and Elizabeth. And some of the dramatic questions that spring to mind as I've watched the film were, and that expressed that inner conflict were very much to do with, will he ever find true connection? Will he ever set himself free from the past and embrace a little bit of this future that is promised to him? Will there be a last hurrah for the character? And so my curiosity brings also to ask, how do you start your writing process in order to express such a interior conflict in a clear way? Do you, let's say amongst the paths, did you start it with a very detailed biography of the character and research into the period, or do you like to go straight away into a rough draft of the script to have like a broad sense of story, or go to the fundamentals for clarity, like I do a synopsis, then an outline, then a treatment, and then yes, a script? Any of these paths or none at all?
I mean, I think I've been thinking about this for a long time. I mean, I listened to that interview with Richard Rogers when I was in my 20s, and I didn't start writing this till
Okay.
30 years later. So but it's in the back of my head all the time. So I would read a biography of Rogers or a biography of Hart or songwriting, and I think there's a part of your mind that is unconsciously assembling the notes for this thing. It kind of knows what you're going to do. And then I kept stalling and stalling, and finally I just said to myself, I have this character who really needs to speak. I still write by hand. I bought a school notebook and a ballpoint pen, and I just let this, I took the brakes off and let this thing go. And, I had a character that spoke for 70 pages, and then I went back and said, okay, what do I have here? And do I have a beginning, a middle, and end? And, who else do I need here? I need Richard Rodgers. I need the girl to, and then I began to shape it along that way. But I think the first draft was, um, I had this guy with all this stuff, this yearning and this anger and this, ambivalence and confusion. And I needed to speak, And part of the fun for me, or maybe it's part of the challenge, was there's almost no, if you want to know what Lorenz Hart actually spoke like, you can't find it. He was on one or two radio shows in the 1930s, very stiffly reading this terrible script. There's a little short film with him and Rogers in which they're reading a terrible, so I mean, if you're going to try to invent what he sounds like in conversation, you really have to invent it. So that was part of the challenge, to say, okay, I'm going to give this guy a voice, and an audience watching it would say, oh yeah, this guy would write My Funny Valentine. This guy would write With a Song in My Heart, that he's romantic and he's also sardonic, and he's, all the things that you feel. That was a fun voice to try to conjure.
I think one of the interesting questions when writing something that comes from real life, and in the case of Lorenz Hart, that's certainly the case, is the debate of how much do I get away from reality? How much do I have license to create freely, which is what any writer wants to do. In my own writings, I have dealt with, there are aspects from reality, real world people or situations that I'm studying to get them done right. But how just right do I want them? There's a part of my brain who gives a shit, let's set yourself free a little bit, because in the invention, you'll find the truth, as well, because art, especially in film, it's like they say, film is an artful representation of reality. And if you can speak truth to that, then you will say what you just said, they will recognize Lorenz Hart in that.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right that if it feels right and if it feels accurate, certainly in the film, that's probably more important than it's technically accurate.
Yeah.
Because if it feels wrong, even if it's technically accurate, you've lost the audience. They're just going to go, this doesn't feel. Humans don't talk like this. Nobody would talk like this. So, I mean, I tried to get the facts as right as I could. I mean, Lorenz Hart really did go to the opening night of Oklahoma, but I don't know if he went to the after party.
Right.
So that once he's there, then I'm allowed to play with it.
And also, upon reading, because we saw the script online, we were reading parts of it, and we got a sense that the final product, let's say the film, it's very faithful to your words, and so we wondered if there were any darlings that he or you had to kill, if there were any moments, any lines that were sacrificed in that process, and was it any debate towards that?
Well, the script was longer. I mean, Linklater, Hawke, and I read this thing together over the course of 10 years many times. And then in the 2 or 3 weeks before the filming started, we really, just every night, we read it out loud. And, I with a pen in my hand. And I never felt, that I was forced to cut things that I didn't want to. And a lot of times I cut stuff and Hawke would say, oh, no, you got to put that back in, There was that, we were looking to make it shorter. So there's that speech about where Hawke has the sexiest thing in the world is a half erect penis. I thought, okay, that's maybe not the greatest joke in the world. So I cut that out. And the next day I get this email from Ethan Hawke. He goes, please, please, please put that back in. I think I can make that really funny. So I got to write Ethan Hawke an email that said, you'll be happy to know I reinserted the penis, so to speak, parentheses.
Oh God, yes.
That was my best email of the experience. So it was mostly, shortening things. And a lot of times, Richard would say, I think we've said this already. I think we've heard this already. We probably don't need to say it twice. And then when we were getting really near the filming, they were saying things like, he says the word Elizabeth too much. Let's cut half of those out. She says the word Larry too much. Um, and they both of them had very good sense of reality. Like when someone said something, they would often say to me, wouldn't Hart react to that? Wouldn't she say something to that? They both have a very good sense of the way people really speak. And that was useful. So it was mostly trying to get it to move a little faster, get Rogers in a little bit faster in the show because it got so energetic when he arrived. But
Yeah.
there was nothing that I felt, oh, this is tragic that the speech is gone. I guess I'm not that possessive of. There's a story that, the famous screenwriter Paddy Chayefsky, there used to be a music stand on the set with his script on it, and he would stand there when the actors read it, and if they inverted a preposition, he would stop them. And to me, it's like, how can you act
Right.
with somebody so
Yeah.
controlling like that?
Mm-hmm.
You want people to, I don't know, just make it their own in some way.
Exactly.
Not wreck it and not lose the music of the words, but at least they have to be true to the way they speak.
And were there any challenges in the many drafts that were that were done about the script? What were the main challenges with the script? Were there any main problems that were difficult to get around and solve? Maybe it took too long the first act, going to second.
Yeah, I think a lot of it in the beginning was to get Rogers in faster. And I think
Mm-hmm.
we got him in about 24 pages now, which is about as fast as we could get him in. Then I was wrestling with the whole issue of Hart being gay and how explicit to be about that and how to bring that in a way that a guy in 1943, this Jewish man who's living with his mother, who's not going to be, upfront about his sexual leaning, and he's not going to be, prideful about it. I think he's going to be um, scared of it in a way. How am I going to get to that? And so a lot of that was in that long scene with Elizabeth, where she finally says, you know, "Can I ask you a question?" My mother, and I thought that's probably the way in. And then how Hart responds. He's going to say something and not say something. No, I had a nice experience. The first day that Margaret Qualley came on the set, they did that scene together. And then she came up to me and she said, "Robert, is what I'm doing as Elizabeth, is that what you imagined?" And I thought for a second, I said, "No, it's not what I imagined, but I like what you're doing better than what I imagined." And she said, "Well, what did you imagine?" And I said, "I thought in my head she'd be kind of weepy when she did that scene. She'd be so hurt by the story of her boyfriend that she'd be kind of on the edge of tears." And I said, "You're much feistier, stronger, humorous." I said, I like much better what you're doing." So she was pleased, and I think it is better. She's a little tougher.
It speaks to her youth, I think, as well.
You're
And
right. That when you're 20 years old, you'd be pretty resilient
yeah,
about what happened, and I think she handles that scene really well. And I remember there's a moment where Ethan says, "Tell me what you really feel about me," or something like that. And
Yeah.
the line as scripted is, "How do you mean?" And Margaret kept saying, "What do you mean?" And I had to try to explain in an email that there's a difference between the two. That when she says, "What do you mean?" it sounds like she's naive. She isn't naive.
Right.
She knows exactly that he's fallen in love with her, like a dozen other men probably have. But when she says, "How do you mean?" she's thinking, how do I let him down in a way that's
Softer.
softer, right? That's the perfect word. And so she changed it. So that was good.
Yeah, but that's very interesting. I mean, in our review, we really discussed that one of the things that is very interesting about how the characters relate is how there's not an overly dramatic scene. There's no weeping scene, both for Rogers and for Elizabeth, but for Elizabeth in particular, when rejecting, so to speak, Hart, there's this understanding of him, and there's this kind of receiving of his love and letting him down kind of softly. It would be expected if she would react like, "I'm disgusted by you, such an older man," but she doesn't do that. She stays there and holds his hand, so to speak, almost figuratively, through the storm. And he comes out the other way, and he has that beautiful line. What is it?
Drunken Beauty.
Yeah, drunk, tell your mother that Lorenz Hart is Larry Hart
Yeah.
is drunk with beauty. Yeah,
Italicizes the
you
word
know,
drunk.
italicize the word drunk.
You know, it's interesting when I signed the contract for Sony on this script, I said to them, may I retain the literary rights to the screenplay? Which I never thought they would say yes, but they did. So when the movie came out in October, I here it is. I put the screenplay up on Amazon.
There you go. It's true. Yeah.
You know, some people bought it. I just thought if you're the kind of person that likes language, you'd look for this. You know, I think like you said, it's on the internet now because it's been nominated and they want Academy members to read it and stuff like that. The nomination thing is like astounding to me. You know, that in this world of, you know, these big booming movies, you know, with vampires igniting on screen, that this small movie, like you said, you know, this chamber piece, four people in a bar, people actually listened and noted it. That was surprising and rewarding.
Definitely. I think the key to that is that, you know, when I read your essays this afternoon, a couple of them, I was really taken by them, and you can really feel a detail in the prose that is very, you know, felt through in the film as well. It's the same thing, you know, it's like you're reading a book live. I think that's part of what is the energy in both situations. The graveyard meeting essay was the one that surprised me the most. How you captured this moment in a book. I think it was Brightest Day. I'm not sure if that was the title.
Yeah.
But you come back to this idea of childish enchantment. You know, if everything that you get to this place that protected under one roof, you can have all of Earth's little things, people and stories. I don't know. It gave me a clear sense of image. You know, when you're reading something and you can, you know, see clearly with a visual sense what the characters are saying, what you see on the written page. When Elizabeth tells her the story of the, you know, her little fling, I can see it in my mind's eye. I don't need a flashback, and I think that's a testament to your writing.
Well, thank you. No, and to me, the nice thing about her telling that story is you see one of the aspects of their relationship is they both like storytelling, and they both like language like that. So when you know Hart is talking to the bartender and saying, you know, she goes to Yale, but it's not the main college. She goes to the School of Fine Arts. And then he stops and he says, Bohemian goddesses in pale smocks, mixing paint in the morning light. And he rubs his hands in delight. I think he's, you know, I mean, he didn't need to say that, but I think he's having so much fun just saying in 10 words, I can evoke cinematically exactly what this thing must look like, you know. And I think you don't know their conversations, you know, that they've had, the history of their conversations, Elizabeth, but you imagine that's part of the fun is they're doing that on each other. So when she's going to tell the story of her boyfriend, she's going to say there was a fingernail clipping of a moon, and there was a ginkgo tree, and it was stained dark by the rain, and there was this lamp with a horse. You know, she's like the paperback version of Lorenz Hart. You know, she's trying to do the very tricks that you do. I can't do them as well yet, but I'm learning and I'm trying, you know.
Irrational adoration, yeah.
Yeah.
So, for this next question, the film, you know, for being so spatially contained and dialogue driven, shares clear ground with theater, and we often need to remind ourselves we're not watching a play. So how has your previous experience in playwriting influenced the writing of this script? Did you mold details knowing the final medium would be film? Did you always envision it as a purely film script, or were you never bound by
I
it?
think when I started, I didn't know what it was. You know, when I first
Okay.
started just writing back in August of 2013, you know, that first big notebook that I filled up, I think I just started, you know, I don't know if this is a monologue or this is, and then it seemed to be a film when I got to the Rogers and Hart stuff and the Hart and Elizabeth stuff. I mean, it's like a play in that I wanted to give people really good parts, you know, parts that an actor could just sing, you know. And I mean, and during the 12 years or so that we were talked about this film, you know, there are a lot of times I thought, I don't know if this ever is going to be made into a movie, but I thought it might be because the parts are so good. That was my one hope. I also thought if it wasn't a movie, I'd try to make a novella out of it, but I don't think it would work that well. I think it works better as a movie. And the thing about a play version of it, and somebody's already approached me about, wants to buy the rights for a plan. And I said, I don't even want to talk about this till the film has played out its life as a film. But it's hard to imagine, like, let's say that scene in the coat room, the 14-minute coat room scene. I mean, if you were in row 120 in the theater or in the mezzanine, would that scene be that powerful? I mean, it seems to be one of the reasons it's powerful is the camera's right here, and you're seeing when Elizabeth has to say, I love you, Larry, but just not that way, you see she's struggling with it and she's on the almost crying because, who wants to say that to somebody? And I don't know if you get that if you were in the mezzanine. If you were in the mezzanine, you go, what did he say? I couldn't hear him.
Yeah, like intimacy like that is a bit difficult to, like in theater, it's harder to communicate.
Theater, you're like throwing your lines to the back of the house and, it's bigger and broader, I mean,
Really brings forth the impact that the camera has on this script, to really get at these details to make it.
Yeah, and that's all Richard, where the camera placement is really good at that. There's that nice moment where she walks out the door with Rogers at the end, and he's saying, with a song in my heart, I behold your adorable face, and the door closes, and it's a glass door with a little curtain on it, but you see Hart through the glass door, and he's just kind of standing there like this, and it's just, I mean, it's a great visual, it's all over moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's Richard. And, the scene originally ended at the bar when they said, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship and all that stuff. That was going to be the end of the film. And then one day in rehearsal in Ireland, Ethan came in and he said, this might be the worst idea you've ever heard, but hear me out on it. He said, why don't we take that speech about Blue Moon, which had been in the middle of the movie, and we cut. And he said, why don't we bring that back at the end? And he's telling the story. And then as he's telling the story, the camera's moving away. And then we end up at the caricatures on the wall. And he says, what do you think of that, Robert? And I said, I like it because Hart's a guy that won't stop talking. And I said, it shows that, even when he's lost everything, his reaction is to be funny and to be resilient and to work the room, do this thing he's always done, which is to be this witty raconteur. I like that. It makes you feel, okay, he's going to go on, with his wit and his originality and his singularity.
I thought that this is a little bit bringing it back again to the scene with Elizabeth, but one of the things that I thought was every time I see the film, I become what they would call a version spectator. In the beginning of the 20th century, you would react and talk to the screen because when I see him in that scene talking to Elizabeth and putting himself down as the friend who listens to these sexual exploits of the person who is the object of desire, I'm just like, what are you doing, Larry? Don't do this to yourself. I'm just saying this all out. So I think this is a perfect effect you can have on someone watching the film, and Ethan does it very well, of course.
No, I think you're right. It's painful to watch because it's so self-destructive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in forcing her to tell the story in all its detail, he's injuring himself. It's like the scene with he and Rogers on the stairs. He's making it worse. Hart is just making it worse. When he starts arguing him about, well, we can do so much better than Oklahoma. We could, it's the wrong thing to say on the opening night of Oklahoma.
Yeah, he's like, you're starting to sound like Yankee Doodle Dandy, like kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, I also find that dialogue exchange very interesting because it shows another quality of the script. Because in that one dialogue between Rogers and Hart, in this place that is a non-place because it's stairs, it's a place of passage, it's not important. People are passing by and they remain there in the middle. Is the fact that they say good things about each other for the first time. They remember the past so warmly, but then it's this road that is rocky. There are moments where they disagree with each other and it's very aggressive, so to speak, and then it becomes softer again and then aggressive again, and it feels like an authentic, natural conversation away from what we would call the fictitious movie land. It feels like a real life conversation because this is what happens. You never know where it's going to go, a conversation between two people. You can exchange beautiful things, but in 1 second you can't say harsh stuff because you just remember something and you hold that resentment. kind of hand in hand with resentment and compliment. And I think that was very well handled in that scene. Was it very overworked, that
Yeah,
monologue?
it was worked on a lot. And I think, as you said, the challenge is to get all that complexity in. I mean, what is it, a 9-minute scene on the staircase? It's not that long. And to also suggest in the same 9 minutes that these guys have worked together 25 years. They know each other, and they also know the pressure points on the other one too. What to say and what not to say, and what's going to get a reaction. And it's emotionally surprising, that scene. It keeps, like you said, they keep stepping over the line, both of them, I think, stepping over the comfort line. And yet, as you said, Roger says to him, I owe my professional life to you.
It's true.
Yeah.
He had this hit when he was the song Manhattan when Rogers was 22 or 23, and that opened the door as the first hit song, and then everything came from that.
Do you remember any key contributes to that scene that revolutionized it, whether from Ethan or Richard, maybe something of yourself that stayed?
I remember saying to Ethan that we were rehearsing the scene, and I said, I've read this script 100 times, and I said, the one line that always almost puts tears in my eyes that still does, is I said, the moment where he says to Rogers, nobody deserves this more than you. You've worked your whole life for this line, and he sort of awkwardly tries to hug him, and look, I'm emotional now about it. It's I mean, and I guess in Crazy Way, it's a love scene,
Yeah,
both of them. It is
definitely.
and I mean, I like in that moment when he says that to Rogers and Hudson. Rogers like, come on, Larry. It's the exact opposite of emotional. It's like, come on, I don't want to do this tonight. Watch you crying on a staircase, and then Hart pulls it back, and they go back to nostalgia.
But it's interesting because he can't help but always seem to sabotage his interactions, and it's even that moment where he gets emotional. It seems like he's I wouldn't say forcing this tragedy, but he can help but have some sort of fun with it and drive the interactions to that place. And yeah, it's at least to me it was interesting to see this character always go to these places of self-pity
Yeah,
almost.
no, he's a difficult character. And I remember watching that scene. They sent me a rough cut of the movie online, and I was watching that scene on this computer with my girlfriend Lynn, and we got to that scene on the staircase, and Lynn starts talking out loud to the screen, and she goes, "Shut up, just shut up." Yeah, that's the way you feel, for Larry. It's like, come on, you're
Exactly.
your foot in the trap here.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's interesting how that, like, and with mirrors, you see mirrors of that both in his relationship with Elizabeth and with Rogers, where you're like, why are you doing this to yourself? And at the same time, why are you?
No, and I mean, his thing with Elizabeth is, I mean, she sees him as this sort of brilliant mentor, and I think he started that way and inadvertently fell for her, and I think he's so lacks confidence, and he's so terrified she's going to be repelled by him physically, which I think she would be repelled by him physically, that he's terrified of saying anything and being too explicit about it until he feels he just has to, he just
Like
has
a
to
defense
ask.
mechanism.
Right. Yeah. Until he just feels pushed in a corner and just finally has to say, how do you feel about me, Elizabeth? Which is not a sentence you want to say in a relationship.
Yeah, exactly.
Should be clear.
Yeah. And it probably is clear to anybody in it. So when you say it,
Exactly.
look what pressure it puts on the other person.
Yeah.
That's why she has to say, how do you mean?
True. And I mean, the line that gets me in that scene is really when he says, why would you drive 30 miles to someone that doesn't love you? That there's these puppy dog eyes, and this break of reality for him that leads to all of that. Would you drive 30 miles for me as well? And I think in regards to the line that touches you particularly in the Rogers conversation, that is, nobody deserves you more than you. I think it's one of the few examples where Hart, for the first time, actually is not talking about himself or
Yeah.
his past or his narrative. He's focused on the other for the first time, and it's about you, my friend, my colleague, you know. So
No,
that's why it feels so striking.
it's nice in both that scene and the Elizabeth scene. It's the times in the movie where Hart's listening,
Hmm.
you know, and
Yeah.
so much is coming out at him, you know, like a hose at all times that suddenly the hose gets turned off and you're watching him take it in. And I think you read how hurt he is too, and how hurt he can be, you know, how vulnerable he is.
And as a final question, do you have any upcoming personal projects that our listeners can look forward to, whether film or any other form?
You know, I'm always writing stuff, and I'm writing stuff now. But until I'm closer to the end, I'm afraid to talk about it because it's like this energy in a little bottle, and I feel like to talk about it is to open the bottle and to let it.
It's true.
Keep it close to
Yeah.
your chest.
So it's like you got to cherish the energy you have until you're closer to bringing it in for a landing, you know.
Yeah, definitely. I heard this metaphor once, which I really like, in which a story or a film or a script is like a gift that you hold on it up until Christmas. Why would you reveal it before? You know, you only
Yeah,
reveal it
no,
then.
that's a nice metaphor. Yeah, that's a nice one. Well, gentlemen, Royale without cheese. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Right.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your
Likewise.
presence. Yeah, for your words.
Thank you so
Of course.
My pleasure.
And that was the latest from Robert Kaplow, folks. We would like to thank his presence here today. He's truly an excellent writer, and remember to check out Blue Moon in a theater near you. If you're a filmmaker running the festival marathon, feel free to send us a message for an interview as well. We will love to promote your work. Don't forget to subscribe, share this interview, or simply give us a like. That's how our podcast can grow ever more groovy. And if you are on YouTube and want to see more interviews like this, check out this next video right here. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.